Welcome to our viewers. I'd like to introduce Stephen Starr, the former director at the University of Missouri, the Clinical Laboratory Sciences. He's been published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, as well as published in the Federation of American Scientists. And today we want to talk about why a nuclear war is unwinnable and should never be fought. So welcome, Stephen. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Well, I started in 2006. I had an article published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists about launch on warning, which is something that we still use today, and Russia does too. The danger that you could have a accidental nuclear war based on a false warning of attack. That article got me invited to the United Nations to speak at a side panel that year. And I was asked back the next year. And at that time, Switzerland and New Zealand were very focused on high alert, launch-ready nuclear weapons. And so I actually got to give a presentation to virtually all the ambassadors at the United Nations about the dangers of nuclear war. I was kind of shocked to find that most of them really had no idea about how many nuclear weapons there were. But also at that time, the new studies, new research was done on nuclear winter that I presented to the ambassadors. And that was, I think that really got everybody's attention. I focused on that research for a long time. I have a website called nuclearfamine.org that discusses a lot of it. The environmental consequences of nuclear war are so extreme that they basically are an existential threat to most people and animals on the planet. And maybe I was naive, but like Mr. Smith goes to Washington, but I thought if I can just show this to enough people and get them to understand what the threat is, and we can stop this. And I was able, in 2010, I gave a presentation to the first committee, which is kind of the equivalent of the General Assembly, it's just a little bit smaller version. And I did show a video of what would happen, the environmental consequences of the nuclear war. As you can see, that ended the arms race, and everything's great right now. I don't know. The nuclear weapon states like to ignore that information, but I think the non-nuclear weapon states took it to heart. A lot of them didn't realize that their populations would be at risk from a large nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And that helped lead later to, I think, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, the ban treaty. I was there at the time when they were voting on it. So that you wanted me to summarize my work. Well, that's kind of the most important part of the work. I've written articles on and off, but a lot of it focused on that sort of information. And I also teach a class now on nuclear weapons at the University of Missouri, which helps me keep me up to date on the information. And it also shows me how uninformed Americans are about the subject, because most of the students I get really have no idea. They don't know the difference between an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb. They're not unlike a lot of the diplomats. So.
Right. Yeah, we plan to do a video later on about nuclear fusion. Now that's controlled nuclear fusion. That's what we want. Right? We don't want uncontrolled nuclear fusion on the planet. That would be the end. So
we're very prepared for that right now.
Yeah, yeah. So you have a presentation, a PowerPoint that you can
Yeah,
show?
it's a sort of an abbreviated presentation from one I gave the other day, but I think it would help educate people. But before I give it, I talked about the studies on the long-term environmental consequences of nuclear war. The first studies were done in the 1980s by Carl Sagan and a group of NASA scientists, and it was called Nuclear Winter. It was a really big deal. It was in 1984, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists made it like their headline. It was the whole issue was on this, and it was the first time in history that the scientists, they used the best computers available at the time to model the effects of a nuclear war, and they found that the smoke and soot that was generated from the massive nuclear firestorms created by thousands of nuclear detonations would create more than 100 million tons of soot and smoke that would rise up into the stratosphere above cloud level. And once it's above cloud level, it can't be rained out. And there would be so much of this that would create, there's high winds in the stratosphere, and basically it spread around the Earth in a matter of 10 days to 2 weeks. And it would remain, well, back then they didn't know how long it would stay there, but they knew it would be there for at least a year or so. They kind of equated it with a volcanic eruption. But that was enough to drop temperatures below freezing every day and, stop crops from being grown. It would, be an annihilation of, most people, because I think we have like 40 or 50 days of grain reserves on the planet. So, trying to live for a year without food would be impossible for most people. So those studies actually made a big impact. Sagan went to the Soviet Union and was talked to the Central Committee, and the Russians were impressed by it. I think it helped lead to the arms control agreements that were enacted in the late 80s and 90s. But then the nuclear industry found this as a threat, and so they actually created some fake studies. They had a study that they used computer models that were erroneous, that showed that the smoke would not go into the stratosphere and be rained out, and they called it nuclear autumn instead of nuclear winter. And basically they were able to discredit the scientists. There's a lot of like Forbes, I think, some of the magazines called the scientists frauds, and it was really a bad thing. So even the people in the anti-nuclear weapons movement became convinced that nuclear winter was just bad science. And so that went on for a while. And then some of the scientists, Dr. Toon and Robach, Dr. Mills, they thought about it for a while, and I wrote to them, asked them to do new studies. They didn't want to at first. They were worried that the studies would show that a nuclear war wouldn't be such a big deal. But in 2006 and 2007, they published new studies that found that the original nuclear winter studies underestimated the environmental consequences of nuclear war. So by that time, in 1986, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons that had been built, which was insane, since 300 nuclear weapons would probably kill everybody in the United States.
Right.
But that's a question of why did they do that? We could talk about later. But they started, the arms reduction treaty started reducing the nuclear weapons significantly. I think there were maybe 20,000. They got rid of 2/3 of them by the time these studies came out. But the studies found that it was still quite possible, likely, to produce a nuclear winter. What they found was the smoke, it would act, the black carbon soot and smoke would act like a solar collector. It would be heated by the sunlight when it rose up in the firestorms. And that would actually keep it in the stratosphere as long as 10 years.
Wow.
And part of what it does in the stratosphere too, it reaches the temperature, the boiling point of water, which catalyzes the destruction of this protective stratospheric ozone layer. So the UV light indices on the planet would go up, they'd more than double. They found that you could get a painful sunburn as little as 7 minutes in Iowa or Eurasia if you were exposed to these. That would probably be within the smoke would block most of the light, but it would come through. So you'd be what that meant then, with the fact that the smoke stayed in the stratosphere for 10 years, was that even what they would call a regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan, they did studies and found that would put between 5 and 7 million tons of soot in the stratosphere. It would block 10% of sunlight. That would create the coldest temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere in the last 1,000 years.
Wow.
It would be about twice as cold as it was in 1816. They call it the year without summer. It's after a massive volcanic eruption. So that actually impressed the people at the UN more, because everybody just had gotten so used to the US and Soviet and Russian nuclear arsenals they said, oh, those will never be used, but the idea that India and Pakistan could create this generated a lot of interest. So, but when these new studies came out in 2006 and 2007, they showed that nuclear winter was still possible and was an existential threat to humanity. They were almost ignored. And it was shocking to me. I won't go into all those details, but I've made a point ever since then to try to publicize this research. That was what I mentioned earlier. And so with that as a introduction, I'll go to my presentation so people will understand that what I show is based on science.
Sure. I'll just show one thing you published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. It's the climatic consequences of nuclear war. And it sounds like this is man-made climate change that we should really be worried about.
Yeah.
This is
Well, I actually wrote the bulletin about that in 2007 and said, why aren't you publicizing this? Because
right.
they'd made climate change like co-equal with nuclear war in terms of what their concerns were. But I said, well, why not talk about climate change from nuclear war?
Right. Exactly.
So I'll let's see here. I want to first talk about what a nuclear weapon is, because as I mentioned, a lot of my students that come into my class are really smart students at the university level, but they don't know anything about nuclear weapons except maybe what they've seen on, science fiction movies. So the Hiroshima bomb, the United States was the first nation to manufacture nuclear weapons during World War II. And at the end of World War II, we detonated 2 atomic bombs. Those were the first nuclear weapons. We detonated them over the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. The Hiroshima bomb exploded with a power of 15,000 tons of TNT, but that's about 1,000 times more powerful than the largest conventional or high explosive weapon we have in our arsenal today. And that's incredible. It's almost hard to imagine. That's an image of the first nuclear test that took place in the desert in the United States before we detonated them. But talking about the explosive power of a nuclear weapon really doesn't do justice to, you don't understand what a nuclear weapon is. Like a piece of the sun. And when it detonates, it creates a fireball whose surface is hotter than the surface of the sun. It's like 4,000 degrees hotter. So anything that's in the vicinity of that is just instantly vaporized. This is a picture of a sidewalk in Hiroshima. There was a person sitting there, and he was pretty much underneath the fireball, and they were vaporized and left only a shadow on the sidewalk. So a fireball like that will instantly ignite fires over a large surface area. The Hiroshima bomb set fires over about 4 square miles, and these fires are different than the fires we're familiar with. What we are familiar with are line fires that the wind blows in a line. But when you set fires simultaneously over a large area, they create a gigantic firestorm that acts like a chimney. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about what a nuclear firestorm is. A modern nuclear weapon, the ones that the U.S. and Russia have, the strategic nuclear weapons, will set fires over tens or hundreds of square miles instantly. And within tens of minutes, all these fires merge and form like one gigantic firestorm. The air temperatures in the fire zone will reach 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit in 20 or 30 minutes. And the winds will blow in towards the center of the firestorm. The fireball raises up and it creates like a chimney effect. So these winds at the periphery of the firestorm are strong enough to like uproot trees. And the temperatures in there will melt everything. They melt asphalt. Anything that's flammable will burn. So nothing will live in this fire zone. If you're in a city where there's a nuclear detonation, you're not going to survive. Even if you go into a shelter, the fire will it'll heat the shelter like an oven, and it'll use all the oxygen up.
So even if you go inside your house and stay away from the windows, like that public service announcement said, that's not going to work, right?
Information, that put out an idea that you could go inside and just wait until hear from the authorities about what to do. Right. If the bomb had gone off 50 miles away, that might be true. But if it went off where you live, there wouldn't be any inside to go to, probably.
Right.
This is what Hiroshima looked like before the atomic bomb was detonated, and this is what it looked like afterwards. It's just, it's 4 square miles of just utterly destroyed city, and very few people survived in that firestorm. So today, the U.S. and Russia have strategic nuclear weapons that are 7 to 87 times more powerful than the Hiroshima atomic bomb. U.S. and Russia each have about 2,000 deployed nuclear weapons. Most of them are strategic, that are ready to use within an hour. This compares the size of the firestorms from the Hiroshima size firestorm, 4 square miles, which is the little green circle there, to the one that I put the ground zero in the same place in a map over New York City. It shows on an average weather day, it would start fires over 152 square miles. And so that's one strategic nuclear weapon. The Russians, this is an 800 kiloton warhead that Russia has 500 of those that they can launch within, 2 to 15 minutes. These are horrible images, but these are the kind of burns that you suffer. If you're 7 miles away from a bomb like that, you'll get third-degree burns on any surface of your skin that's exposed to it. 9 miles, you get second-degree burns. Now, this is a video of a nuclear test that we did in the South Pacific of a strategic nuclear weapon. And that picture is taken from a distance of 50 miles away.
Wow.
These palm trees are on an island that would be in the fire zone created by the fireball. You can see they're beginning to burn. When the fireball expands outward, it creates a layer of compressed air that forms a blast wave that moves outward at hundreds of miles an hour. That circle you see spreading out over the surface of the ocean is the blast wave. And it's moving towards that island. It takes a while for the blast wave to reach, if you're a number of miles away, it takes 20, 30 seconds. And the image shows the blast wave approaching on the ocean, and then it hits the palm trees and just blows them apart. So that's a strategic nuclear weapon. So in 5 to 15 minutes time today, the US and Russia can each launch 800 to 1,000 of strategic nuclear warheads at each other. My computer's thinking here. And let's see, there we go. These warheads will be delivered by intercontinental ballistic missiles that are land-based. They're silos. The US and Russia each know where the silos are. They have 30-minute flight times from one continent to the other. The silos are targeted. If there's a first strike, we'll try to take out the Russian silos and vice versa. The US and Russia also have nuclear submarines that carry submarine launched ballistic missiles. These, like the land-based missiles, can carry multiple warheads, up to 10 warheads. And they are independently targeted warheads, so one missile can destroy 10 cities. If you park a submarine off the coast of the US or Russia, it's much closer than the ICBM, so it can hit targets in a little as 7 minutes or probably less. Well, if you're in the United States and you detect, the NORAD is given 3 minutes to detect and confirm an attack. And if they confirm it, then they contact the president, and he will have about a 30-second conference to decide whether or not to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike. Because if you got a 7-minute window from where the missile's launched to when it hits Washington, D.C., then you don't have much time to decide. If he decides to retaliate before the weapon arrives, then he'll order a nuclear attack, and it takes 2 to 3 minutes to give and transmit the launch order. Then it takes about 2 minutes for the ICBM launch to occur. The launch officers in the Minuteman silo are there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they're always waiting for the launch order to come in. They call them Minuteman missiles because it only takes a few minutes to launch. And it'll take longer for a sub because it takes longer to transmit the orders, but the U.S. always keeps 4 submarines in what they call hard alert status in a position to launch. And, each sub carries about 24 missiles. They can carry up to 10 warheads. Right now, they supposedly carry less than that because of the limitations on the START treaty. If the warning of attack was false, you just actually created a nuclear war, accidental nuclear war, by launching what you would think was a retaliatory strike. It was the first strike. So I'm going to show a video. This is animation that was created by a German animator. It's based on the idea that sometime this winter, the US and Russia will get into a war in Ukraine for whatever reason. So in retaliation for a US cruise missile strike against Russian forces, Russia fires a missile, and it sinks a US guided missile cruiser in the Black Sea. The US decides to retaliate, sends aircraft carrying B-61-12 nuclear weapons, and they sink Russian ships in the Black Sea. Russia then strikes NATO targets throughout Europe. The U.S. launches a massive nuclear strike against Russia, and Russian early warning system detect the launch, and they launch a massive nuclear strike against the U.S. and Europe. I mentioned there's 4,000 nuclear warheads between the two countries that are deployed and operational, and about 3,000 of those detonations occur in 1 hour. All the major cities of Europe, the United States, and Russia would be incinerated, and the massive nuclear firestorms would cover more than 100,000 square miles. Everything remotely flammable burns in the fire zones. These firestorms, the studies I mentioned predict that these firestorms would produce 150 million to 180 million tons of soot and smoke. And this smoke would rise rapidly above cloud level into the stratosphere. I'll show an animation here produced by UCLA scientists that depict the smoke spreading around the world and forming a global stratospheric smoke layer. The smoke layer will block warming sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface, and it will remain in the stratosphere for 10 years. So the loss of warming sunlight would create ice age weather conditions around the Earth. The temperatures would fall below freezing every day for the next 3 years in central North America and central Eurasia. The ice age weather then would prevent food crops from being grown for 10 years, and most humans and land animals would starve to death. And this would be a mass extinction event. This image was created of a farmer in a barren field looking up at the sky. The sky is not cloudy. That's what the sky would look like. That's smoke blocking the sunlight from reaching the surface of the Earth. I read that, at noon, the sun would resemble a full moon at midnight. That's how much light would be coming down in the Northern Hemisphere. So that's what I wanted to show to the United Nations, and I'll get back to my Zoom screen if I can find it here. Okay, stop share.
Oh, that's
it's hard to talk after you show that. I always get worked up. It's just it's such a.
It's
I almost
terrifying.
feel teaching my students about this sometimes because it's a heavy weight to put on people, but we're all in the same situation right now. We're all at risk. US and Russia have these launch-ready nuclear weapons that can be launched in just a matter of a few minutes. The Russians can launch with remote control. They can override all the lower levels of command and push a button and launch all their missiles. They have communication rockets that they can use if the national leadership is killed by a US nuclear first strike. There's guys in a bunker about 60 miles away from Moscow that will launch these communication rockets that will order every surviving Russian nuclear missile to launch. And so we've got this kind of self-destruct mechanism set up for the human race, and we got to figure out a way to turn it off.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole issue that's facing us right now. How do we turn this off? And I wanted to talk with you about John F. Kennedy, because we're going to be launching a major campaign, and really every American citizen. And I'm very glad that you still teach, because you have very lucky students that can hear what you're saying, and also the fact that the American population has become so detached from reality in a certain way. This has got to be addressed, but part of it I think is hopelessness, and I think that hopelessness comes from, as was discussed in a Schiller Institute conference yesterday, when you get a great leader or even a pretty good leader, they seem to be assassinated, either literally or overthrown in some way, a character assassination, physical assassination, color revolution, and it's in the United States, and it's worldwide as well. Any leader that actually pushes for peace and development, which common sense should be, that's great. That's what we want. But that's what,
a hopeful vision of the future. That's what Kennedy gave us.
Exactly. So I wanted to just read a couple things from Kennedy, and then get your reaction. First, I just wanted to cite his inaugural address, because he's coming in. You have the Cold War has been launched. Winston Churchill has come over after we successfully defeated the Nazis, and Churchill comes over and delivers the Iron Curtain speech. Harry Truman is not the man that Franklin Roosevelt was in terms of his vision of a post-war world, and Kennedy wins the presidency and comes into the White House, and he offers a completely different view of the future. And it seems to me, looking at his speeches over the course of his 3 years as president, it becomes more and more refined. And well, we'll just see here. He says in his inaugural address, "We dare not tempt them, the Soviets, with weakness, for only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed. But neither can two great and powerful groups of nations take comfort from our present course. Both sides overburdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of the deadly atom, yet both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror that stays the hand of mankind's final war." So he recognized it was a final war. Nobody would survive a nuclear war. "So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Let both sides explore what problems unite us instead of belaboring those problems which divide us. Let both sides, for the first time, formulate serious and precise proposals for the inspection and control of arms, and bring the absolute power to destroy other nations under the absolute control of all nations." And this, I think, is the most important. Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depths, and encourage the arts and commerce. So I thought I'd start with that. What a beautiful idea.
His speeches are very inspirational. And I noticed too that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he's brought face to face with nuclear oblivion, which was almost a miracle that we avoided a nuclear war then, but we wouldn't have had diplomatic contacts going the whole time. Then he really, that's when after that they got the Limited Test Ban Treaty set up. And he went to the United Nations to talk about the nuclear sword of Armageddon hanging over our heads. And so I'm like 12 years old then. But everybody was sort of inspired by Kennedy. I felt that even as a kid. And it was just a horrible day when he was killed. It was just doom and gloom. And so, we haven't had any precedent since then that really came close to enunciating. Trump did suggest that we should have a, detente with Russia, and I think that was part of the reason he was drummed out of office. But
absolutely,
it doesn't seem like it's gotten any better since he left. But,
no, I remember the speech that he gave in 2017. It was probably April of 2017, and he just said, and it was so refreshing because you hadn't heard a president say something like that in such a long time. Maybe, Ronald Reagan saying nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought, or this kind of thing. There was a sense of hope. But when Trump said, believe me, we don't want a war with Russia or China, nobody wants that. It's better to be friends than to be enemies.
Well, Trump wasn't a Kennedy, but, he at least he brought that topic back into the conversation. And it was, only lasted for a little while, but I think there are some people that are such powerful, charismatic leaders, and Kennedy was one of them. And Martin Luther King, and even Kennedy's brother Robert, was they had the potential to change things, and they were all killed.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, so I was thinking about this in terms of JFK. So he says what he wants to do when he comes in, and then you have Bay of Pigs, the Berlin crisis, the Berlin Wall. These are all could have led to really, it could have led to a world war, a nuclear war, and then, as you mentioned, the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, and what he then did, which I wanted to discuss and a little bit here. I think in one sense, what I've been thinking about is that he was handed this mess when he came into the White House, and there were crises similar to what we have right now with the situation in Ukraine, which has been completely brought on by, it didn't start in February of last year. This has been completely brought on by NATO expansion, one thing after the next, a color revolution in Ukraine in 2014, where we overthrew the legitimate government of Ukraine. Why? Because they wanted to have good trade relations with Russia. That's not allowed in the neoconservative view of the world. We have to control everything. It's really insane.
NATO started training Ukrainian troops, 10,000 troops a year after that. After 2014, they started pre-positioning supplies for a war. There was a general that just mentioned that in an interview. The mindset was that Ukraine was going to be used in a proxy war against Russia.
Right, exactly. And the whole thing was a lie in terms of the Minsk Accords, because as we're now finding out from the French and Merkel, they very cynically they said, we didn't really believe in that. So here you have
that was actually the last straw for Putin. I mean, the fact that Merkel and Allende and even Poroshenko, all the guys that signed the Minsk Accords, came out and said, yeah, it was a ruse. We were just trying to give Ukraine time to rearm, and you have to look at that in the context of all the arms control agreements that the United States has abrogated. We went back to, we got rid of the ABM treaty under George Bush, I think in 2002. Then we got rid of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. We got rid of the Open Skies Treaty. We've abandoned the fissile material cutoff treaty. I mean, these were all the cornerstones of, the only thing that's left is the Starr Treaty. But, when you have partners that just break any agreement whenever it's convenient to them, the Russians have a word for it. It's called non-agreement capable, and that's how they view us now.
Right. And it's when you listen to Kennedy, obviously what Kennedy's talking about here is this idea of both parties have to be able to trust each other. And you could tell with John F. Kennedy that he meant it. He says here, what kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children, not merely a peace for Americans, but a peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age when great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age when a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force developed by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never use them is essential to keeping the peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Now, I understand you have your students listen to that speech.
I do. I mean, and I say, when was the last time you heard anything like this? Because it's, people, every generation tends to grow up and think whatever they hear around them is normal, and that's the way it's always been. But I think it's really important to, I want them to hear hopeful ideas too, because, when you have a class on nuclear weapons and nuclear war, some students wind up thinking that mutual assured destruction is the answer, because I think they don't see any way out of that, But the problem is, I asked them, do you think nuclear deterrence will work forever? Because that requires that everybody be rational, sane. There's no accidents, miscalculations. There's no madness involved. And it's obvious, we can't maintain this status quo forever. And particularly now when we've been, they've been building usable nuclear weapons like the B-6112 weapon, that the lower yield on that, the lowest explosive power is 0.3 kilotons. That's the equivalent of 300 tons of TNT, which is 27 times larger than the largest conventional weapon, but it's not that much. I mean, when you think the Hiroshima bomb was 1,000 times larger. So, if you give that to a field commander and they're thinking, well, all we need to do is take out this one target. But once you start detonating nuclear weapons, then the Russians have plenty of nuclear weapons too. So that's what it sounds to me. These people think they can fight a limited nuclear war, that they can somehow prevent, they can shoot off one bomb and stop the Russians from shooting it at them. The Russians have disavowed that idea for a long time, but it still seems to be popular in the United States.
Yeah, this is an op-ed from the Wall Street Journal. The U.S. should show it can win a nuclear war. It's just absolute madness, and you see the way that people have changed their thinking in the United States versus this hopeful idea that John F. Kennedy had. And he had his share of lunatics to deal with in the day, but at least we had a president that thought that way, and that would make the whole country more hopeful, obviously. One thing I wanted to,
election process for presidents, it's, you can't even nominate anybody that thinks that way anymore. They're blocked from it, at least for the right. Democratic and Republican parties. But that, it's like a uniparty now. That's the war party. The Democrats are all enthusiastic about war. I mean, everything's turned on its head. That used to be they represented the working class, and that's all gone.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the Democrats are more gung-ho for war than the Republicans at this point, it seems. I mean, there's some lunatic Republicans there too, but
they have no understanding of what nuclear war and nuclear weapons do. I think if you confronted them, I did some lobbying one time, and I got one of the members on the House Armed Services Committee in a hallway, and I asked him, and I mentioned how many nuclear weapons the United States had, and he was, really? I mean, they don't even know what the arsenals are. These are the guys making. I was at the UN, and it was when the U.S. was doing the nuclear posture review when Obama came in, and they had a guy from the State Department and a general, and these guys were directly involved in the nuclear posture review, decides what the U.S. does with nuclear weapons, how many it has, where they're used. And I got into this meeting, they didn't want me there, but I asked the general, I said, well, are you familiar with the long-term environmental consequences of nuclear war? And I mentioned the studies that I talked about. And he said, well, I've never heard anything about that.
Unbelievable.
I wrote an article for the Federation of American Scientists called "Turning a Blind Eye Towards Armageddon. U.S. Leaders Reject Nuclear Winter Studies." And I got information from a friend of mine who was a very active lobbyist in Washington, and he had firsthand information that these people are on a very small committee, the most important committee in the government that makes decisions about nuclear weapons, and they includes like the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and they said, well, we don't believe in nuclear winter. That's not true. So that worries me almost as much as anything, because if they don't even understand what the weapons can do, then they're more likely to use them.
Right. Yeah, and the horrible thing about it is, even if it wasn't as bad as it was, why are we even talking about this, right? Why aren't we doing what John F. Kennedy? Wouldn't it be a much brighter future if mankind were working together on solving the common problems of humanity?
We've spent enough money on nuclear weapons since we started working on them to probably rebuild every house in the United States, every structure.
Yeah, our infrastructure is a disaster. We get D- from the engineers every year, and we're not investing in our physical economy in the United States.
I want to talk. I've been working on a paper for 4 years. It's kind of turned into a book, really, on electromagnetic pulse from nuclear detonation. It's called high altitude electromagnetic pulse. And I've got very authoritative studies from the Meditech Corporation. The guy that runs that, Dr. William Radasky, he helped write the guidelines for the Defense Department on EMP. And they state unambiguously that a single nuclear detonation that creates this electromagnetic pulse will bring down the national electric grid in the United States. And the key components are the large power transformers. There's only a few thousand of them, but they're usually greater than 100,000 kilovolts. And we only have 8 companies in the U.S. that manufacture these, but not very many. We currently import about 82% of those from overseas, and the lead time is 2 years. Then it takes a long time to ship them because you have to send them by sea, and then the average weight is between 400 and 800,000 pounds for each one of these transformers. So trying to move that's bigger than a railroad car can carry. So basically, it would take at least a couple of years, maybe even double that, say 1 year to replace these transformers. But in the meantime, the United States would be without electric power, most of it, entire regions. And and if you think about what that means, it would be fatal to most people. So that's one more thing that's not even addressed or thought about in this context of nuclear war.
Yeah. Well, clearly, I mean, if the United States, Russia, and China did work together, we could solve the problems of mankind. And it's obvious that there is a group of people that don't want that to happen, period. And, that's what we've got to expose and shut them down, before mankind is done. I wanted to just reference one other thing from this American University speech from Kennedy, which I think is important. He says, "Let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find, on page after page, wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of wars, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and achieve world domination by means of aggressive wars. Truly, as it was written long ago, the wicked flee where no man pursueth. Yet it is sad to read these Soviet statements to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable." Now, I was really struck by this because, clearly Kennedy did not intend this kind of ill will towards the Soviet Union or any other nation. In fact, Kennedy was completely committed. His other crime in the eyes of these people would be the development of the entire former colonial world. Great development potential in Africa and Latin America. And but could a president honestly say today that that's not the policy of the United States and England? Great Britain is pushing this stuff hard. And really, I think, I don't know what you think about this. I think a lot of this policy comes from Great Britain. And the United States used to have a different policy. From John Quincy, from Washington in his farewell address, and John Quincy Adams, look not for monsters to destroy abroad. But we got taken over by this kind of imperialist thinking of the British Empire, and it's very un-American. And we should drop it. And Kennedy was a real American in his outlook there. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with you. You mentioned the Bay of Pigs when Kennedy came in. When he backed out, the intention was to create an invasion of Cuba after the Bay of Pigs invasion, and Kennedy prevented that, and the CIA was furious. And before he was assassinated, he was going to dismantle the CIA. He was going to break it into 1,000 pieces and not have any, wars being fought overseas by the CIA. He also intended to. He started issuing silver certificates. The Treasury can issue its own money. We don't have to get it from the Federal Reserve. Mm-hmm. Those were all recalled. He made enemies in a lot of places,
Right.
But those are the kind of things. Now we have a $30 trillion national debt that's owed to a privately owned bank. Why is that? We could issue our own money. We don't have to borrow it from some bank.
Right. Well, that's a topic for a whole other discussion for sure.
Yeah, it is.
but
right.
We're at the LaRouche organization.
The biggest crimes take place out in. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say. I mean, this is exactly right. This is the whole financial system right now is a bubble waiting to blow. It's fictitious debt. That's what's constantly left out of the equation of this war policy. I mean, war is a way of maintaining your financial power over the world. And if you have a lot of debt, you can also use
the global reserve currency. Yeah,
right.
The U.S. has a global reserve currency, and that's being threatened by Russia and China and Iran. They're abandoning that. They're actually setting up a commodity-based or gold-based currency as an alternative.
Right.
And, without that, then countries don't buy, they don't hold and buy treasury notes. They don't finance U.S. debt. They also, OPEC is becoming a member of BRICS, and they're going to allow oil to be bought with the yuan, so the dollars, the petrodollar is going to evaporate, and all these things are a terrible threat. We can't afford 800 or 1,000 military bases overseas if we can't finance them with digital currency that we create out of thin air.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this gets into a whole other discussion of Hamilton. No, I love it. No, absolutely. Hamiltonian credit, right? Like you said, we can issue credit. We don't need a Federal Reserve to issue credit. We used to have national banks. We had two national banks that issued credit for investment in productive activity, internal improvements, infrastructure, farms, factories, and if we created a credit-based system again in the United States, where money is used as a tool for real investment in productive activity, because I think that's what China and Russia are tending towards right now. And that's why another reason why they're seen as an enemy to this global financial elite.
But that's attractive to most of the other nations in the world. Like something like 75% of the world population supports Russia and China right now. We're the ones that are the bad guys.
You mean because they might actually be able to develop for the first time, as opposed to being under the conditions of British colonialism or the International Monetary Fund or some other financial dictatorship?
It's so ironic that, we used to talk about the international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Well, now it's Russia talking about that. We talk about rules-based order, which means our rules and we give the orders.
Right.
Oh, it's everything. It's like Alice through the looking glass. One of the things I have in my class that I have the students do is learn about the Soviet Union in World War II. They lost 27 million people killed when they were fighting the Nazis. We lost 400,000 people killed in World War II. We didn't win World War II. The Soviets won it.
for sure.
So, I mean, all these things, but our educational system gives us a skewed view of the world. You know, I've always thought the U.S. won World War II. I mean, we're the good guys, right? But we're not seen that way anymore.
Right. Right. And now we're not even allowed to celebrate, the Soviet victory against the Nazis. You know, we don't even we last year we didn't celebrate that in the United States. It's really
when they had the 75th anniversary of the defeat of the Nazis, the Moscow invited all the Western and American leaders to come to the celebration. Well, they all refused, and instead NATO had war games in Estonia, which is like with an artillery range of St. Petersburg. And that was also where Operation Barbarossa was launched against the Soviet Union in World War II. I mean, you think they didn't notice that?
right.
I mean, the Russians people now see the United States as the enemy. That wasn't the case at the end of 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. The Russians expected to become partners with the U.S. They expected to be, but we never would treat them as equal partners. We kind of looted their country with the people that we sent over there from Chicago, and they had the biggest depression in the 20th century. They had millions of people die as a result. They remember all that. Putin came in and their standard of living's gone up. China's raised the standard of living out of 800 million people out of poverty. It's like you said, they are improving the quality of life for their people. And
with the end of the well, even before the Berlin Wall came down, you may or may not know this, but LaRouche gave a speech. Lyndon LaRouche gave a speech at the Kempinski Hotel, where he made a proffer to the Soviets, basically saying, "Look, if we'll help with showing modern agricultural technology, and you free Poland." And there was a whole discussion about it. But then when the wall came down, he put out a thing called the Productive Triangle, and the idea was to work with Russia on developing their physical economic capability and welcoming them in. And of course, Putin just recently said what you said. We hoped that we would join the West when the Soviet Union collapsed. We had a lot of optimism we would join the West, but you never intended for that to be allowed. And so what choice do we have now? And it's just a horrible, horrible thing when you think about it, that if we had different intentions, it would have been totally different.
It's going to take a lot of time to reverse that, but we at least have to start. And the first thing we need to do is stop sending hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons to Ukraine. Now we're getting ready to send battle tanks. I mean, we continue to escalate there. If we get into a direct military conflict with Russia, then there's not going to be much of a future, I'm afraid. But we got to get rid of these leaders that can only think about war. And we've got so many. You could build enough new high schools in the United States for 25 million students with the amount of money they've sent to Ukraine, and right. They're sending more and more. I mean, it's such a waste, and but it's not only that. The war was almost over in April and May, and there was a peace agreement that they had signed that Zelensky agreed to that was going to end the war, and then Boris Johnson went over and they tore it up, and that's when NATO started sending all the equipment. So we prolonged this war, and as a result, there's like 150,000 Ukrainian dead and 250,000 wounded. I mean, it's a massacre. Yeah. Their hospitals and their doctors can't care for the wounded. I read that they have tuberculosis spreading among the troops. I mean, there's all these. It's a nightmare scenario, and that's what our tax dollars are doing right now.
Right. Right. Well, I think there seems to be some fight in Congress right now. There's a call for a new church committee. Right. To investigate all of the weaponization of the government against the American people, which is critical to this because anybody that speaks for peace gets targeted, and
well, I decided to volunteer my services to Diane Starr when I saw her speak on the Duran.
I know her.
This is the first person I've heard running for the Senate that everything she says, all the things that I think, I mean, about and the danger of nuclear war and the importance of, helping people. And I admire the Schiller Foundation for promoting that. I don't hear this from any place else. Even the people that are supposed to be anti-war groups and stuff, they turn a blind eye to NATO, what's happening over there. I think that the propaganda, the news media in the West has become basically a mouthpiece for the official narrative.
Yeah.
And, you know, the New York Times used to be the paper of record. And I know so many people that they read that every day and they believe every word in it. And it's created a real problem to try to communicate with people. You know, it's just almost like a different reality, like a matrix sort of situation. But so I just think it's important for anybody that thinks differently, they need to speak out and act now.
Absolutely.
Or else we're going to blow ourselves up pretty soon.
Yeah, right.
You know? I mean,
Exactly.
we got to stop this.
Exactly. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us in this interview with the LaRouche organization. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate everything that you're doing. And I think together and by mobilizing other people, we're gonna, you know, save civilization from this impending nightmare. So thank you very much.